It is June 29th, 2025, and Russia is continuing its escalated drone and missile attacks targeting Ukraine. This, as we also have reports that Kiev has lost yet another F 16 fighter jet and a pilot. We don't know exactly how many trained pilots and F 16s they actually have, but it's really not looking good. Not quite the wonder weapon that Zelensky thought that they were, you could say. We also have the latest tensions as the NATO alliance got together last week. They surrounded Trump and rallied around him and made the summit all about him and all about quote unquote security for Europe. So, what does that mean in the long term as the focus is shifting now away from Ukraine and onto this continued extended war with Russia? Well, we got into all of that and more on this week's episode of Sanctioned, an exclusive weekly deep dive series for my paid subscribers. Mr. Jax is here to tell y'all hi and to let you know all about it. As we have a free preview of this week's episode here for you now, I'm going to go get him a treat. Would you like a treat? All right, take a look at a preview of this week's episode. Now, you may be thinking, well, the NATO alliance just had this big summit over in The Hague last week. Surely the members are going to get together and come up with something, right? Some sort of roadmap to move forward. Except that does not seem as though that is what is happening, or maybe not the kind of roadmap we are thinking that they would be putting together, right? You would think just from everything we've seen from NATO so far that their goal would be to ramp up support for Kiev, to throw more weapons and lethal aid at Ukraine, and to make sure that they can keep fighting against Russia. But what were the headlines from the summit? Oh, they were all about one US President Donald Trump. And in particular, you had NATO's newer Secretary General Mark Rutte fawning all over Trump, right? Acting as though he needed to just shower him with praise, calling him daddy, which is the dumbest and most ridiculous thing I've heard in a while. Why is he doing that? Well, the media would have you think it's because Trump has been very skeptical and critical of NATO in recent months. He's been skeptical and critical of Ukraine as well. And he's almost made it look like he's ready to make the move to pull the US not only out of the Ukraine war, but out of the NATO alliance altogether, because he's sick and tired of dealing with these people and he doesn't want to do it anymore. So if NATO thinks that Trump just needs some more attention, then surely they're going to give it to him, right? I mean, that's of course why you saw the alliance come together to give approval to this new grand plan that would see NATO members, with the exception of notably Spain, pledge support for allocating 5% of their country's gross domestic product to defense spending by 2035. And yes, that is more than double the current target of 2% GDP allocated to defense spending. So I am not exactly expecting the NATO alliance to bend over backward to get to 5% when some of their members haven't been able to even get to 2%. But it does speak to Trump's biggest complaint about the alliance during his first term, which was that these members were not pulling their weight, that the US was having to, go above and beyond. They were all just relying on the US, that in the event that the NATO alliance was attacked, that then the US military would come in and save the day. So here we are in Trump's second term, and you've got the NATO alliance saying, hey, Trump, we took your biggest complaint. We're telling you, not only are we going to work on it, but we are going to pledge to spend 5% of our GDP on defense, just in 10 years down the road. But the interesting thing to me is how much of the focus was on defense spending and, the quote unquote security of Europe while they're waging an all out proxy war against Russia. Not exactly very good for their security, but how that was the topic of the conversation versus just support for Ukraine, which is what we would have seen arguably in the past, right? You've got to really up your support for Ukraine in this ongoing war against Russia because Russia's the bad guy. And I would argue that this shift in focus is not just about Ukraine, it's about preparing Europe to carry on the bulk of the responsibility for this very long proxy war that is ever expanding against Russia. That's why Ukraine was only mentioned twice in the joint statement released by the NATO alliance following their summit last week, with reports noting that the main focus was on raising defense spending goals and increasing military cooperation between members. Zelensky was also largely sidelined during the summit, although he was seen wearing a suit as he finally got his meeting with Trump a week after the two leaders were set to meet at the G7 summit in Canada. But as we all know, Trump was a little bit busy dealing with the tensions that his administration was actively creating in the Middle East, so he had to run back to Washington, D.C. to deal with things there, as we had the Israel attacking Iran and Iran retaliating against those attacks, inflicting significant damage in Israel. So we did eventually see this reported meeting between Trump and Zelensky, and Trump seems to have had positive things to say about it, right? He has a glowing review of Zelensky. Well, that's all fine and good, but it doesn't seem as though there's any meaningful change, right? We're not even seeing what we've seen in years past, which is a number of these countries within NATO just throwing weapons and supplies and money and all that at Ukraine. Now we're seeing a lot more of a focus on commitments, right? We're going to give you X, Y, Z in the long term because that is what these countries have to give at this point. And because, as I noted earlier, when you're talking about Europe getting prepared to take more of the responsibility of this proxy war against Russia, they now have to start thinking about themselves and their quote unquote security as they are waging war against a neighbor on their same continent. And even the New York Times is calling the NATO summit's focus on Trump yet another grim sign for Ukraine, and noting the US hasn't approved any additional lethal aid packages for Kiev since Trump took office in January. And they say that the remainder of the aid approved by Biden before he left office is expected to run out this summer. And with Russia continuing these nightly bombardments consisting of hundreds of drones and missiles and continuing to make gains on the battlefield, not only can Kiev not keep up, but the entire NATO alliance cannot keep up. And they don't seem to have any real concrete plans in the near future to even try to keep up. Not that they necessarily could when it comes to overall production in the way that Russia has been able to, right? Russia has looked at this and said, okay, how can we shift our economy? How can we meet the needs of this war, as they call it, a special military operation, and make sure that it succeeds? Because we have to remember that Russia's goal here, and part of the way why they have gone about this in the way that they have, is because they are not just looking to gain territory or to gain more of Ukraine. They are looking at this as a war of attrition, and their goal is to completely destroy and cripple Kiev's military as a whole. So whenever they're carrying out these nightly drone bombardments, or they're focusing on what villages they're taking on the battlefield, all of that is playing into this larger strategy. But we also have to remember that the US is also pursuing its goals in this proxy war. And those goals have nothing to do with Kiev winning a war against Russia. They also have nothing to do with Kiev getting back any of this territory that it has lost to Russia. No, the goals set by Washington are to do everything that they possibly can to weaken Russia. And that was a free preview of this week's episode of Sanctioned. You can catch the full episode live now over on my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. You can also find it on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and we'll see you next time.